chapter 6, verse 30, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like a sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place. The hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages to buy themselves something to eat." And this comes right off of what we did last week, where we have the disciples had been sent out for their first type of mission, where they were sent out in pairs to go and to minister around the countryside to different villages. And now they've returned. We got the story last week of John the Baptist being beheaded, and then this falls right after that. And they're returning from being out on their own to Jesus, and they were so excited. They come in, they're telling Jesus of all that they did, what they taught to people. And when I was looking at this, I noticed there was a nice mixture of words and actions, because you notice in verse 30, they said they told him all that they had done and taught. So they mixed words and actions. And I think we have to be sure, or make sure, that we don't get too heavily tilted to one or the other, too heavily focused on the actions that we're not considerate of what our words are saying, but on the other hand, not going so far on the words that we're not doing any actions. We have to constantly be working to keep that balance between what we're doing and what we're saying, and make sure that we're doing and saying things that line up with what Jesus is telling us. And Jesus saw how they were beginning to lean heavily on actions and works, and he told them to come away on a retreat type of rest. You notice he says that they didn't even have time to eat. There were so many people coming and going because they're doing so much. And so he called them away to rest and recover. The disciples were working so hard, like it says in verse 31 there, they did not even have time to stop and eat. And we, the same way, we can't just work. We must take time to rest. We must take time to recalibrate our mental state with God, recalibrate and replenish ourselves physically, so that we can be physically rested, so we can have a longevity in life and to live a long time, to continually do God's will until he calls us home. And spiritually, we have to refresh our spirit. We have to go to God and to rejoin with him, to go with God and to just be refilled and refreshed in his presence. Because we lose when we give constantly to other people, we have to go back to the source of our giving, which is God, to replenish ourselves and keep going. Being along with him allows us to keep a balance. And when everything else in our lives is all out of whack, when we're with him, we can have that balance. And so Jesus told them let's go in the boat and go to a desolate place. But the people saw them, and they raced ahead to get where they were going to land. And when I was looking at this, and I was like, okay, if they took a boat to leave, usually you take a boat because the speed of the boat is better than walking. But this boat, apparently they weren't going fast enough, or maybe far enough, to really cover a lot of ground and make a lot of speed up. Instead, they were in the boat, and it seems like they were just coasting and gliding along with the wind and the current, not trying to make a lot of time. So the disciples were clearly not hard at the oars, rowing the whole time, trying to make it there as fast as they could. Instead, we have, it seems like they are there, and they've already started to rest in the boat. And they might have been expecting a weekend off, a few days of being relaxing with Jesus when they go. But the boat ride, that was their time alone with Jesus. And I believe Jesus was serving his disciples. And it doesn't say this in the scripture, but I think during the boat ride, Jesus was replenishing his disciples, that he was teaching them, listening to them, and letting them be restored in him during the boat ride. So that once they get off the boat, they're ready to work again. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about how many times I'm traveling somewhere and I completely waste the travel, whether it's in a car or maybe I am traveling by boat or train or bus, you name it. How often do I waste that travel time where I could be replenishing myself by reading my Bible, where I could be uh, ministering to someone else traveling with me, but instead I go to sleep or I do something else. So don't waste our boat rides, metaphorically. So whatever that boat ride may look like, whether it's car, train, airplane, bus, you name it, don't waste those. To use that and to find Jesus in those. And when they land, I hope that they use their boat ride to replenish themselves, because when they land, they immediately hit the ground running. Because Jesus saw this crowd and he had compassion on the people. And we, and especially me, this is me talking to myself a lot here, we need to have more mercy and compassion on people when we see them, especially non believers, because they're sheep without a shepherd. And I'm not sure who said this quote first, but I always thought it was a good one. It always stuck in my memory, and I want to share it, and I think about it often. We should not be surprised when lost people act like lost people. We need to be more gentle with the person who is not a Christian than the Christians in our churches. If you're a Christian, I automatically should hold you to a higher standard because you are a child of God. You are representing Jesus Christ. Whereas a lost person, I shouldn't be upset or surprised in any way that they're acting just like a lost person would. I should have mercy and compassion on them because they're a sheep without a shepherd. The disciples, they seem a little bit cold hearted here because they tell Jesus to send these people away to go buy food. And maybe they were being cold hearted, or maybe there was something else on their mind. Maybe they were a little bit sad or bitter that what they thought was going to be a long time with Jesus was being interrupted by this huge crowd of people. Maybe the idea of, oh, we're never going to go away from all these people. I just want to learn from Jesus, but I can't get him by myself. Or maybe they realized just by the pure number of people that were there that there was no way they could feed them all. Even the closest town wouldn't even have enough food for them to buy to feed them all. It would take the surrounding villages. Because notice it says, send them to the surrounding countryside and villages to find something to eat. So there's so many people here that just one village can't feed them. And the disciples, they're looking at this and they tell Jesus, hey, send these guys away, send these people away so that they can go find something to eat. But they made the mistake of telling Jesus what he needed to do, rather than asking Jesus, what should we do? And I thought that was real telling here. Here's the disciples. They're going up to Jesus telling him what he should do, when it should be completely flipped. They should be going to Jesus, hey, we have this great crowd here. What do you need us to do, Jesus? And they missed that opportunity. But we're going to see in verse 37, he answers them, you give them something to eat. And when they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said, we have 5 and 2 fish. And then he commanded them to sit down in groups on the green grass. And so they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up into heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves, and gave it to the disciples, and set it before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate, and were satisfied. And when they took up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of the fish, broken pieces and of the fish, and all those who ate the loaves were about 5,000 men. A remarkable story here. And Jesus stuns the disciples. Where the disciples came and said, hey, we have a plan, send them away. Jesus looks at the disciples and says, no, you feed them. We don't need to assume that it's somebody else's job to care for the people around us. The people around us are around us, and we're Jesus's ambassador. We're his representative on earth in our communities. Uh, we are his missionary. We are his minister that's been put there. And we don't need to assume that the people around us should care for themselves, even if they could. Think about, instead of thinking, okay, well, that person, they could go get a job and take care of themselves, or any number of situations, instead of putting it off on somebody else, assume the responsibility on us. Take that responsibility and say, no, I'm going to try to bring God glory in every situation by doing whatever I can to help the people around me in his name. Now, the disciples did some quick math, and it would take roughly 200 days' wages. That's what 200 denarii is. A one denarii is about a day's wage. And so the average worker would make 1 denarii per day, and it would take 200 days' wages to buy bread for them all. And Jesus said, well, what do you have? And he said, 5 loaves and 2 fish, and it was enough. See, Jesus doesn't call us to do things in order to watch us fail. If God calls us, if God wills it to happen, we cannot fail. Don't assume that a task is really big. If a task is really big, that there's a need for us to go find resources to make it happen. Jesus gave them a mission. He said, feed them. And they realized they couldn't. Then Jesus asked them, what do you have? And they told him 5 loaves, 2 fish. And he said, start there. He didn't tell them to go buy more. He just said, what do you have now? And that's where we're going to start. And so whether he's telling me, whether my calling is to go and be a great teacher, or to maybe go to another country eventually and teach there, to live there, we start where we're at. I start right here, and I'm faithful with what God's given me, and I work with it, and then he gives more, according to what his will is, not my will. And so I have to be faithful with the little. And so start where we are, and then take the next step. Constantly taking that next step in faith, and let God show up. And to do things that are big, so that the only way that it works is if God comes through for us. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs of how this miracle happened. It may have been like the jars of oil from the Old Testament, that they just continually poured them out and they just kept filling back up. But it doesn't matter how it happened. The fact is, it did happen. And the task that was impossible, it was too expensive, beyond all the resources of the disciples, it was accomplished when Jesus and their obedience met. When Jesus and the obedience of his followers met, the mission was accomplished. And I think that's a big lesson for us. When our obedience, it lines up with God's will, that's when things are going to happen. That's when big things are going to happen for God. And there was more than enough food for everybody in this story. And just a side note, it says at the very last of verse 44, there were 5,000 men. So we're just counting the adult men there, not counting if the women are there and if their children are there. So let's just assume that the women and the children are there as well. And let's assume that there's 1 woman for every man, so that's 10,000. And then if there's 2 children for every man, well, now we're at 20,000 people. So there's really no telling. It could have been anywhere from 5,000 to 20,000 people that were all fed during this miracle. So this is a massive, massive miracle that was done here. Oh, so let's continue. So in verse 45, and immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go out before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, where he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up to the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. This is one of my favorite passages, not because of the walking on water, but the very beginning of this passage. Jesus tells the disciples, "You guys get in the boat, and I'll catch you later. I'll catch up on in a day. I'll catch up tomorrow." But notice what Jesus did. Once he had sent them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And I always read this, and I'm thinking to myself, if Jesus Christ, God in flesh, if he needed time alone with God, if he needed to just let everybody else go away so that he could go and have one-on-one time with God to replenish his soul and spirit, how much more do I need it? If Jesus needed time alone with God, I need it so much more. And so he made time to be with God alone, just him. And we need to model this constantly. We need to always be looking of how can I get more time with God? How can I steal time during the day? If I'm driving in my car, is there a way that maybe I can take my phone and record me reading the Bible and listen to it in my car? Find ways that, or we can spend the whole time in our car praying, or when we're waiting on something to pray, but to find time to be with God, alone with God. Now, this boat ride for the disciples was much different than the boat ride they had had previously and what we just talked about. See, the previous one was more like a slow-paced cruise where they were there talking with Jesus, sharing their experiences from the weeks and days before, whereas this one, they're going directly into the wind, and the wind is pushing against them, and they are hard at the oars. And the word says here, they're painfully making headway because the wind was against them. And so the disciples here are in a struggle. They're alone and they're struggling. And Jesus, we get here in, I missed my verse. And here we go. In verse 48, there at the very end, it says, "And he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass them by, or to pass by them." And I looked at that and I was like, well, Jesus was going to walk right past these guys. The one that he saw them struggling in the boat. He saw them painfully at the oars trying to get it to go, and he was going to walk right past them. And I wondered why. Why would Jesus, seeing the disciples struggle like that, why would he, instead of going straight to them, intend to pass by? And I had questions. I don't have any answers here. I just have questions of what it could. Was it so that he can allow them to struggle on their own? Was it so that they could remember the previous boat ride with Jesus was so wonderful? It was a nice slow cruise. The wind was with them. They didn't have to push hard, and they just coasted. Whereas this one without Jesus, it was almost like they were in a storm, and the wind was making it as hard as it could for them not to advance. Or maybe it was to show them that they would have a much harder time without him. Was it the result of fear or humility that they called out to Jesus? And I was looking at it, it's fear. It says they were terrified when they saw him. They weren't so much terrified of the wind. They were terrified of what they saw when Jesus was walking across on the water. It wasn't humility. They could have saw Jesus walking on the water, recognized it was Jesus, and not assumed that it was a ghost. And they could have asked Jesus into the boat. They could have invited Jesus in, but they were terrified instead. And for Jesus, he responded to their fear. But I think it would have been much more to their credit if they would have recognized Jesus and humbly said, "Hey, this is much easier when you're with us. Come help us, please, Jesus." And so when he gets in, the wind ceased. They were astonished by the wind stopping. And I was wondering, it doesn't really say that they were astonished by him walking on water here. They were very astonished with the wind stopping. It says that they were still not understanding what happened with the loaves of bread. But there's Jesus walking across the water, and it's like that's the least of their worries. To me, the things that the disciples saw this day should have just blown away any doubt that they had of who he was and what he was teaching them. He had fed 5 to 20,000 people with one picnic that a little boy had. He walked across water, and he got in the boat, and the wind ceased. So nature responds to him. But it says their hearts were hardened because they were still thinking about the food. They were still thinking about the past miracles that they had witnessed. and they missed the miracle that was right in front of them. They missed the miracle that they were in the moment right then. And I wonder us, how many times, because we're so focused on the highlights of the past, because some people, they talk about how they are so stuck on the bad things in their history that's attacked them that they can't move forward. But I think a lot of times for people, we get so focused on the good things that happened in our past, that, oh, the highlight of, oh, you remember when I did this, this, and this, and when Jesus did this, it was so amazing he did that. And those times are great, but we can't get stuck on that. And we can't be thinking, oh, I hope one day I get to experience God like that again. Instead, we should be thinking of, oh, I hope that one day God does beyond that, something even greater for us that we can see, so that we can see even more of God. So encouraging things here, don't get stuck on things from the past and miss what's happening right here in front of us like the disciples did. Last one for tonight, and this closes out chapter 6, and this is Jesus healing the sick in Gennesaret. And so when they crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him and ran about the whole region to bring the sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came, in villages, cities, or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. So I looked up on some maps just to see where we were, because if you remember in chapter 5, there was a lady who had 12 years of bleeding, and she touched just the cloak of Jesus' garments, and she was instantly made well. And the best I could find, this is a neighboring town to the one she was in. So I think she was in Capernaum, and this is the next city, the next town over, not very far at all, probably about 5 to 10 miles, maybe a little bit further than that. And it's interesting that when they get here, people recognize Jesus for who he is, and they're looking just to touch the fringe of his garment. And I was wondering, I was like, it seems like that lady who had been bleeding for 12 years and just touched the hem of his garment as he walked by, it seems like she'd been telling an awful lot of people of what happened to her. It seems like she was using the suffering that she had been given, the 12 years of suffering that she went through, and then she was healed, and she was not wasting much time telling others what happened, telling others what had changed her life. So when Jesus comes back to that area, you have people that aren't asking him to come touch them or to come throw demons out. Instead, they're just asking, let us get close enough, Jesus, that we can touch your garments, and that's good enough for us. We have that kind of faith. And I wonder about us, the suffering that God has given us and the things that he's healed us from. Are we using them to make much of him, or are we still distracted by the discomfort, the inconvenience, the pain, the suffering, the heartache that has caused us? And I think we need to leave here tonight, or this morning for you guys, we need to leave here focused on using our stories to make much of Jesus. Even the parts of our stories that hurt in the past, use them to make much of Jesus. But also to use our stories that were highlights in the past to make much of Jesus right now in this moment.